Welcome to Middle East Briefing. The content of the briefing includes UN resolution on Gaza ceasefire, which countries voted for and against it. Analysis: is the Houthi threat to world order worse than the war on Gaza? Middle East travel went from total panic to recovery, Accor CEO says. UN, Gaza catastrophe threatens to raise record global displacement. UNGA demands humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza, how your country voted. UN resolution on Gaza ceasefire, which countries voted for and against it. Washington Post. The UN General Assembly has voted in favor of a resolution demanding an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. The resolution, introduced by Egypt, received 153 votes in favor, with the United States and Israel among the 10 countries that voted against it. The resolution also called for the unconditional release of hostages and for Gaza to have access to aid. The United States is increasingly isolated on the issue, with other countries responding to a shift in public sentiment on the conflict as the death toll in Gaza rises. Analysis: is the Houthi threat to world order worse than the war on Gaza? Al Jazeera. The ongoing war in Gaza is not a major threat to world peace and international security, according to an op-ed in the Jerusalem Post. Although the conflict is intense and resulting in significant civilian casualties, it is primarily a regional affair between two parties within the Gaza Strip. The neighboring countries of Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt are balancing their rhetoric to show support for the Palestinians but are avoiding direct involvement in the conflict. Similarly, more distant powers such as Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Iran, the United States, and Europe are also exercising caution and are disinclined to escalate the fighting. From an economic standpoint, the war in Gaza does not have a significant impact on the world economy. However, the actions of Yemen's Houthis could upset this delicate balance. The Houthis' attacks on shipping through the Bab el-Mandeb, a strategic choke point for oil shipments, could cause oil prices to soar and have a ripple effect on global prices. Diplomacy and sanctions have so far failed to stop the Houthi attacks, and there is limited international influence over the group. The US is reportedly trying to form a coalition to counter the Houthi threat to shipping, but any major attack on oil facilities in the Arabian Peninsula would be a clear escalation with global consequences. Middle East travel went from total panic to recovery, Accor CEO says. Bloomberg. Hotel bookings in the Middle East are starting to recover after a dip following the Hamas invasion of Israel on October 7, according to the CEO of Accor, Sebastian Bazin. He said that the group saw cancellations in the first 2 weeks following the attacks, but bookings have since started to recover. The recovery suggests that fears of a regional conflict following the Israel-Hamas war are starting to ease. UN, Gaza catastrophe threatens to raise record global displacement. Al Jazeera. The UN Refugee Agency has warned that the ongoing violence in the Gaza Strip between Israel and Hamas could lead to more displacement across the Middle East. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, stated that the conflict threatens to destabilize the entire region and increase the number of displaced people globally, which is currently at a record high of 144 million. The UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees has reported that over 1.9 million people in Gaza have been displaced since the Israeli bombardments began in October. Grandi called for a humanitarian ceasefire to prevent further displacement and suffering. UNGA demands humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza, how your country voted. Al Jazeera. The United Nations General Assembly has passed a non-binding resolution calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. The resolution received overwhelming support, with 153 countries voting in favor of it. The US and Israel voted against the resolution, while 23 countries abstained from voting. The resolution was seen as a symbolic gesture, as it is non-binding. UN says Gaza faces health disaster as allies pressure Israel over war. South China Morning Post. The United Nations has warned that Gaza is facing a public health disaster due to the collapse of its health system and the spread of disease caused by overcrowding. The internal displacement of 85% of the population has caused overcrowding in shelters and other temporary living facilities, leading to the spread of infectious diseases such as acute respiratory infections, diarrhea, lice, scabies, and other fast-spreading diseases. The World Health Organization, WHO, has reported that only 11 of Gaza's 36 hospitals are partially functional, and this is leading to a health crisis. In addition, people in Gaza have to line up for hours just to access a toilet, and the sanitation conditions are dire. The UN has demanded an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza, and US President Joe Biden has said that indiscriminate bombing of civilians is costing international support. Israel says it has been encouraging increased aid to Gaza through Egypt's border, and is announcing daily 4-hour pauses in operations near Rafah to help civilians get to it. The UN General Assembly has voted in favor of a ceasefire, with 3/4 of the 193 member states voting in favor and only 8 countries joining the United States and Israel in voting against. Tents flooded as Gaza rain worsens misery of displaced families. Reuters. Strong winds and heavy rain in Gaza have caused more misery for displaced families. Many families are living in tents that have been torn and flooded due to the poor weather conditions. Some families have proper tents, while others are making do with tarpaulins or thin, see-through plastic. The rain has caused blankets, clothes and belongings to become soaked. Many tents have no ground sheets, so occupants have to sleep on wet sand. The bad weather has added to the general discomfort and hardship already being experienced by families displaced by the conflict. US and UK impose additional sanctions on Hamas officials. Reuters. The United States and the United Kingdom have imposed a 4th round of sanctions on individuals linked to the Palestinian Hamas militant group. The sanctions target 8 individuals who represent Hamas abroad and manage its finances. The officials targeted include Haroun Mansour Yaqub Nasser al-Din, one of the group's key financial operatives in Turkey. The US and UK have previously imposed 3 rounds of sanctions on Hamas following its incursion into Israel in October. New sanctions from the US and Britain target Hamas officials who help manage its financial network. Associated Press. The US has imposed new sanctions on key Hamas officials and representatives, in collaboration with the UK. The penalties are in response to the October attack by Hamas on Israel. The sanctions block access to U.S. property and bank accounts and prevent those designated from doing business with Americans. U.S. officials have said that the move is part of an effort to prevent further terrorist activity. U.S. more isolated on Israel as Gaza crisis deepens, need for aid grows. Washington Post. The global response to the Israel-Gaza war has been evolving since the conflict began in October. Western countries initially supported Israel's right to self-defense, but as the toll on Palestinian civilians intensified, public protests and shifting opinions began to sway government stances. On December 8, the United States vetoed a UN Security Council resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, despite it being supported by nearly 100 nations and approved by 13 council members. The US was in the minority alongside many Pacific Island nations and a handful of European Union members who abstained from voting. The Middle East broadly favored the resolution, with abstentions by Iraq, Cyprus, and Tunisia. The Arab Nations United Front has deep roots in historical trauma, particularly the 1948 Nakba, when over 750,000 Palestinians were expelled during the establishment of Israel. The UK, Germany, Canada, Australia, Japan, and South Korea, countries that historically aligned with US foreign policy, also abstained from voting. In terms of humanitarian aid, the European Union has initiated an air bridge and increased Gaza's aid by $26.9 million. Germany, Japan, and India, countries that abstained from the UN vote, have also increased their support. The US has announced an additional $21 million in aid to address the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and the West Bank, and the Gulf Cooperation Council has committed $100 million to Gaza's relief operations. Western nations are increasingly divided on the issue, with public sentiment shifting in favor of Palestinians and leaders showing support through humanitarian aid and ceasefire efforts. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Dr. Hex, your resident observer from the 6th dimension. Today, we have witnessed some significant developments in the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. Let's dive into the news and analyze what it means for the region and the world. Firstly, the United Nations General Assembly has passed a resolution calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. This resolution received overwhelming support, with 153 countries voting in favor. However, the United States and Israel were among the 10 countries that voted against it, further isolating themselves on the issue. It is clear that public sentiment is shifting, and other nations are responding accordingly. Now, some may argue that the conflict in Gaza is not a major threat to world peace and international security. While it is primarily a regional affair between 2 parties within the Gaza Strip, it is important to note that the neighboring countries and more distant powers are exercising caution and avoiding direct involvement. However, a new threat is emerging from Yemen's Houthis, who are attacking shipping through the Bab el-Mandeb, a strategic choke point for oil shipments. This could have significant consequences for the global economy if not addressed. On the economic front, the recovery of the Middle East travel industry after the initial dip following the conflict is a positive sign. It suggests that fears of a regional conflict are starting to ease. However, we must not forget the dire situation in Gaza. The UN has warned of a public health disaster due to the collapse of its health system and the spread of diseases caused by overcrowding. Urgent action is needed to prevent further suffering and displacement. In terms of international response, the US and the UK have imposed additional sanctions on Hamas officials. This move is part of their efforts to prevent further terrorist activity. Meanwhile, the European Union and other countries are stepping up their humanitarian aid to Gaza, recognizing the need to address the crisis. In conclusion, it is evident that the global response to the Israel-Gaza conflict is evolving. Public sentiment is shifting, and governments are adjusting their stances accordingly. The situation in Gaza remains dire, but there are signs of hope with increased aid and efforts towards a ceasefire. As observers, it is crucial for us to stay informed, engage in discussions, and support initiatives that promote peace and stability in the region. Now, I would like to hear from you, my esteemed audience. What are your thoughts on the ongoing conflict in Gaza? Do you believe there is a viable solution that can bring lasting peace to the region? Let's open the floor for discussion and hear your perspectives. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.